Jewish Live, and you can check them all out at jewishlive.org/on-demand. So we hope that you'll do that, but I'm going to pass it right back. Thank you to JWA, and Judith, all yours.
Wonderful. And I just want to say that I started the live stream a little bit late. I apologize for that. So I'm just going to reintroduce that. Welcome to the Quarantine Book Club. We're delighted to have you here, hosted by the Jewish Women's Archive and Jewish Live. And we're so thrilled to have, hundreds of people with us for this evening. As you have seen, people are introducing themselves in the chat. We love to know who's with us. We're sorry that we can't have video and sound for everybody, but that's because we have such a wonderful, robust group with us tonight, which makes us really, really happy. So please introduce yourself in the chat. Let us know your name and where you're coming from. Also feel free to ask questions in the chat box and I'll bring those into the conversation. Tonight, it is really a true honor and delight to have with us Rabbi Laura Geller. Rabbi Geller was the third woman in the Reform movement to become a rabbi and the first Reform woman rabbi to be selected as a senior rabbi of a major metropolitan congregation when she became the rabbi at Temple Emmanuel of Beverly Hills in 1994. She has been recognized with many awards and honors, including being named one of Newsweek's 50 most influential rabbis in America for 2 years in a row and one of the Forward's most inspiring rabbis in 2015. When Rabbi Geller was the executive director of the American Jewish Congress Pacific Southwest region, she created the AJ Congress Feminist Center, which became really a model for other Jewish feminist projects around the country. And we are really honored to have her on the board of JWA. And so glad to have you here with us tonight.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
So I have your book, which I love, Getting Good at Getting Older. And I've been giving it as a present to many, many people.
Thank you.
I would love to just start with a little bit of the story of the origin of this book and how did you come to work on this project?
So I was 62, I'm now 70, and I was beginning to think about the next stage of my life. I gave a sermon that was entitled, Will You Still Need Me When I'm 64? I wasn't really worried about losing my hair, maybe I should have been, or whether somebody would still need me and feed me 2 years later. But I did notice that a huge percentage of congregants were boomers and many were leaving the congregation. So the sermon led to a listening campaign where we met with 250 congregants in each other's homes. And we asked them how they felt about this stage of life, this stage between maturity when they were building their careers and raising their families and frail old age. It turns out that that's a new stage of life. It didn't exist for my grandparents. We're now living approximately 30 years longer than people were a century ago, thanks to advances in medicine and education and science. But these years are not tacked on to the end of our lives, but in the middle, between midlife and frail old age. It's a whole stage that didn't used to exist. So this listening campaign asked people in the congregation, well, what do you want in those extra years? What keeps you up at night? What gets you up in the morning? In other words, what are your concerns and what are your hopes? So people were most afraid of four things: becoming invisible, becoming isolated, becoming without purpose, and becoming dependent. And in the conversations, lots of issues emerged. Issues like, as our community's changing and friends move away, kids too, with whom do I want to grow old? And in what kind of setting? Do I want to age in place? Do I want to move to a retirement community? Do I want to share my home? So that was one set of issues. Another had to do with navigating changing relationships, friends, nurturing long-term commitments, letting go of toxic friendships, dealing with older parents and millennial kids, how our relationships with our intimate partners change. A third issue that kept coming up was, what do I have to do now to become the 85-year-old I someday hope to be? What work on myself do I need to do? And how can Jewish wisdom and spiritual practice help me do that? Ultimately, the questions were about, how do I keep learning and growing? What new rituals do we need at this stage of our lives? How do I deal with illness, my own or that of my friends? What do I need to do to get ready for the inevitable? What kinds of conversations should I be having with my adult children? Why is it so hard to have those conversations? And what will give meaning to my life now that I don't work full time anymore? How can I find a place where I can still feel purpose? How do I live a legacy as well as leave it? And how could a connection to our synagogue and the Jewish community make a difference at this stage? So all of those questions led to this book. And in a way, it was an obvious project for me to do with Rich, my husband, because as you are about to tell us, he was the co-editor of the first Jewish catalog, which was a do-it-yourself kit in the 60s and 70s. And now we are in our 60s and 70s, and we still need a little instruction about how to get good at getting older.
So that was one of the things I was thinking about when you said, and I have my copy of the Jewish catalog here, my original copy, which is quite faded, but still usable in our house frequently. You know, so you talked about how this book was something that came out of really recognizing that this was a new reality, that people have this life stage where they're still very active, but also older and maybe post-career or figuring out their kind of encore career. So it's interesting to me that you looked back to an older form of, you know, a kind of older model for addressing creativity in Jewish life, because that's really what the Jewish catalog was. Is, as you said, it was meant to be the kind of Jewish countercultural whole earth catalog and a do-it-yourself guide, and really a kind of exploration of how to be, how to approach Jewish living with an eye towards tradition and towards creativity, and make it something that you would actually want to live, not just something that would sit on your bookshelf. And so it's very practical. And I, you know, the Jewish catalog, for those of you who don't know it, and I was born the same year it was born, and the same year it was published, and actually grew up in the community that produced it. So it was very much an active part of my life, but it covers everything from how to tie tzitzit to what Shabbat is, to what is gematria, to how to build a sukkah. It's very practical, and also addresses a lot of kind of existential questions about what Judaism is for. So why go back to this model for your project?
The Jewish catalog named a moment. It didn't create the moment, but it captured a moment. And we're in another moment. And both Rich and I felt that we could capture that moment. And basically, the Jewish catalog was created because a bunch of people wanted to know how to build a sukkah, and they didn't know how to do it. And they went into the backyard and they said, whoa, there should be a whole earth catalog about how to build a sukkah. And that's what led to the Jewish catalog. Well, those very same people now, a bit older, a little less hair or a little grayer hair, you know, want to learn how to get good at getting older. And we need tools, and we need a conversation. And it's a moment that we could grab. And that's what led to the book. And like the Jewish catalog, this book is not a sermon. It's an irreverent, thoughtful, engaging, funny. It's laid out like the Jewish catalog, with cartoons and words of wisdom, some from the tradition and some from modern Jewish folks. One of my most favorite images in the book is a photograph of a tombstone in Iowa, a woman named Menster, and it is a cookie recipe. So it's the picture of a cookie recipe. And apparently on the other side of the tombstone, it said, whenever anyone asked Mom for her cookie recipe, she said, over my dead body.
Yes, I appreciate the sense of humor that is baked into the book as well, and its practical nature. So you talked about how you started it when you were 62, or you started this project when you were 62, and now you just turned 70, Mazel Tov, Ad Mea V'Esrim. So how did the project evolve and change over time, and were there surprises along the way?
Well, there were a lot of surprises along the way. One was how hard it is to name this stage. What do we call ourselves? Well, some of us call ourselves boomers, but you know, that's the technical category. It isn't necessarily a life stage. Someday our millennial children will be in this life stage. So it's not really about boomers. We are naming a new life stage, not just about us, but for the people who will come after us. Do we call ourselves seniors? If we had a screen of everybody and I said, how many of you love to be called seniors? I bet it would be a kind of a mixed response, right? I like those senior discounts, but I'm not so sure I'm comfortable being called a senior. Retired, well, some of us didn't work, so we're not exactly retired. Seasoned, an elder. People sometimes don't like that because it sounds elderly. I'm not elderly. On the other hand, elder is a category of great honor in many religious traditions. Is this the third chapter, or is this the encore generation? In Japan, apparently they call folks in our age cohort yold, standing for younger, older. And the name I actually like best is perennial.
Oh, I like that too. That's nice.
So that's the first thing that was a surprise. The second thing that was a surprise is how important friends are as we get older. That was something that I don't think we actually realized. I was struck by finding in Betty Friedan's book that she wrote in 1993 called The Fountain of Age. This was a long time before anybody was talking about this stuff. She wrote, more and more psychologists have found that for older persons, loneliness is not necessarily linked to the death of a spouse or to how infrequently they see their children or grandchildren, but to the absence of personal relationships with peers, friends of their own age or any age, who share their interests and with whom they sustain their roots of shared experience. So that was a surprise, the significance of friendship and how it changes. Another surprise was how much in denial so many people are about getting older. Sure, there's ageism out there in the world, and that's real. The last socially sanctioned ism. But the real issue, I think, is internalized ageism, our inability to acknowledge that, yes, we are in fact growing older. Another surprise was how hard it is for people like me to ask for help, even when we need it. Another is how few people in this age cohort have shared their end of life wishes with their adult children. Everybody in my congregation had written those. Their lawyers had them, their doctors, but they had never had the conversation with their adult children. And talk about a setup for a tragedy, that's it. Another surprise, and I think this is really urgent, particularly now, is how real the epidemic of loneliness is. As we get older and our social capital constricts, we are more lonely. And in fact, there is another plague right now, the plague of loneliness, not just for younger olders or for very old people, but for people across the generations. Vivek Murthy, who is the former US Surgeon General, said that loneliness and social isolation are associated with a reduction in lifespan, similar to that of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, and even greater than that associated with obesity. So this is a real issue, and it's particularly exacerbated now. Another couple of surprises, how myopic the Jewish community is about this, when it thinks about the future just in terms of families with young children and how invisible this cohort is. Another surprise, not to many of you on the phone, I'm sure, but our kids don't want our stuff. That is also a surprise. What do we do with all the stuff that we have when our kids don't want it? And lastly, and this really isn't a surprise, but how important it is to have a sense of humor about all this stuff.
So there's so many things there that I want to dig into, but let's talk about what you referred to, which is that we're having this conversation in the middle of a pandemic, and a pandemic that has a particularly heavy impact on older people. And so it's meant that though all of us are confined in various ways and restricted in our movements, it's really in particular older people who are cut off from other people and from going out in the world. So what would be different if you were writing the book now? Is there something else that you would want to add that would speak to this moment?
Well, first of all, one of the real changes that has happened because of the pandemic is that you can't pretend you're not getting older. I might say, I'm still young and active and, I'm not really whatever, but the bottom line is I now have been designated as vulnerable because I'm over 60. And that, I think, is the beginning of some kind of acknowledgement that, yeah, this is a new stage and we are getting older. And, you know, what does that mean? The second thing that I think that is important for us to think about is the tension between generations. You know, on the one hand, there's this meme out there in social media that this pandemic is a boomer remover, and that, you know, it's okay if older people die because we need to get the economy started again for our grandchildren. So there's that on the one hand, and I think that that's very frightening for a lot of us. But on the other hand,
and not only frightening, but very dehumanizing in general for people to think of it that way.
But it's happening, you know,
right.
Maybe a small group of people, but it's still happening. Mm-hmm. On the other side, though, intergenerational connectedness has never been more important, right? I couldn't be functioning as well as I am if my wonderful stepdaughter wasn't willing to come once a week and go shopping for me. I need somebody who's younger in my life, and cultivating relationships with younger people is hugely important. Mm-hmm. At the same time, for a lot of us, our adult children have moved in with us so that we can help them out or to help take care of grandchildren. So what does this intergenerational possibility offer to us at this moment? I think that's you know, a really important thing that if I were writing the book now, I would want to think more about. Mm-hmm. And finally, the most important way it would be different is technology. There's hardly anything in the book about technology. And if I were writing it again, there would be a chapter not only about how to use it, how to access it, what are the tools and resources, but also how we can use it. How do we use Facebook or Instagram or whatever, WhatsApp, to stay connected? That piece is missing completely, and I would definitely want to include it if I were doing it again.
Well, if you had done that, I assure you that part would be out of date in approximately 3 months. So it's probably good you didn't include it. Although I think that the larger conversation about how to get over fear of technology, or how to, you know, and this is connected to the intergenerational piece too, how to learn from one another, or how to frame I mean, I think about this in my own work. How do we meet people, you know, how do we meet people where they are and give them the tips that they need so that they can feel comfortable using a particular technology?
Right. I do find in my work here in Los Angeles, where we have created a village where people from 2 synagogues are joined together, everybody living in their own home. It, as important as all this technology is, regular phone calls, regular buddies, checking in with people regularly becomes hugely important, and in some instances actually life-saving. So, but still, we need to think about it, and not, you know, it's a language that I don't speak, but it's a language that I need to at least learn how to speak a little bit.
So the comment you made about kids not wanting stuff has generated a lot of interest in the chat, and it's a very familiar piece. And I think that also, to me, connects to another theme in your book, which is about the importance of sharing your story. Because I think so much of the reason why our things matter to us is because they represent a particular memory or moment, and there's like a story that inheres in the object. And we often think that by leaving the object to somebody, we're somehow passing it down. But actually, I think in the end, what's really most important is the story of it. And one of the things that, I mean, at JWA, we're obviously very interested in stories. And in fact, some of the work that we're doing now is around creating new technological tools so that people can more easily capture their stories and share them. And we created an app called Story Aperture, which has prompts in it and questions in it, and allows you to record right in your phone and upload to our site with a photo. And I've been actually encouraging people to use this as a way of encouraging decluttering, to say, okay, if I'm going to go through all this stuff and I'm ultimately going to have to get rid of it, why don't I tell the story of each object, take a picture of it? And that is a way to tell stories. And in fact, in our oral history work, we often encourage people to start with an object, to bring an object and tell the story of it, because it's a way of kind of it's hard to know where to start, right? When you want to share your whole life. But if you can start with a few things that mean something to you, it's a way to begin. And so we use that as a kind of trick in some ways. But I think actually, you know, we use the object as a trick for storytelling, but I actually think storytelling can be used as a trick for letting go of objects. So I love the part of your book where you talk about tips for sharing stories. I want to make a plug for Story Aperture as a way to do that, but also connect those two pieces, the stuff piece and the story piece.
So actually, when we can see each other again, one of the real gifts that you can give to somebody who is older that you love is to walk with them around the house and have them tell those stories while you're standing with them in front of those objects. And you're absolutely right. It helps people let go of things, and it also is a way of being seen and being heard.
Some of the most beautiful parts of the book are ritual related, are kind of how you make meaning from these challenges that you see in the lives of older people. Would you tell us a little bit about one or two of the rituals that you talk about in the book?
So to set this up, I want to remind everybody that we learned this from Jewish feminism. When I was a rabbinical student in the early 70s, I learned that there was no important moment in a lifetime of a Jew for which there was no ritual. And then I realized that it wasn't true, that there had been a lot of moments in my life as a Jewish woman that were not marked by ritual. And what I discovered at that moment is that my experience is Jewish experience. And there is a Torah of my life that is powerful and connected to the Torah of tradition. And so in the 70s, a whole lot of new rituals were created that acknowledged the truth of what we want to be true, that there's no important moment in the lifetime of a Jew for which there is no blessing. So if you look at life cycle ceremonies, starting with when I was a kid, a book that talked about what are Jewish life cycle rituals, bris, Pidyon Haben, bar mitzvah, confirmation, marriage. It wasn't my life, and my experience wasn't in it. And the ritual that came after marriage, or divorce in my case, and then marriage again, was a funeral. Ironically, God willing, I'm going to live a lot more of my life between that first marriage and my funeral. Well, what about that stage of life? What are those moments that I want to mark with ritual? So what the book does, it doesn't script these rituals, but it challenges us to think about what are the moments when we might want to create ritual. A major birthday, stopping full-time work, when children leave home, giving up the keys when you know it's no longer safe to drive. This is a really big one. Becoming a grandparent, taking off a wedding ring, downsizing. So in the book, we, again, give you a way of thinking about it, but there are a couple of stories, very short stories. I want to read one. This is from a congregant in my congregation. Saying goodbye to the house where you raised your children isn't easy, but it's easier if you actually say goodbye. Our daughter, her boyfriend, my husband, and I walked through the rooms of our home, stopping in each one to share good memories and to honor the room for its service. After our journey through time, space, and love, we shed a few tears, toasted the house, and sent it on its way to shelter and protect a new family. Before the ritual, we were stuck, painfully holding on to the house we had built 27 years before when our daughter was born. But after the ritual, we felt joy and contentment as we realized how rich these years had been and how ready we were to let go and move on. An unforeseen benefit is that our daughter's boyfriend now feels more connected to the life and history of our family and says he can't wait to be part of the new memories we make together in our condo. We can't wait either. So that's an example of noticing what's happening, taking it seriously, recognizing the divinity, however we understand that, in a moment, and paying attention. So another more personal ritual that, again, these are not in the book, they are, we just encourage you to think about them, was the ritual that I created when I took off my wedding ring after Rich died. The other surprise that I didn't mention is that how is the book different than the one we started to write? Rich died during the process of writing the book, and I finished the book the year after he had died. So after a year of mourning, it felt really important for me to take off my wedding ring. And I gave a lot of thought to it, talked to a lot of friends and colleagues about what the moment meant to me. And I realized that what it meant was I wanted to thank the people that had been there for me during his illness and the year of mourning, without whom I would not have, survived. But I also wanted to signal that I was moving on, and that as much as I loved him, he would always be a part of me. I will continue, God willing, and get good at getting older in a different way than I had planned. So who to invite? I have lots of circles, right? And I decided I wanted to keep the circle very small. It was in my home. We did it around the time of Havdalah, the ceremony that separates Shabbat from the rest of the week, with the images of bringing the sweetness of Shabbat into the rest of the week. I was very lucky because the people who had given Rich and me our rings during our ceremony, our wedding ceremony, are still in our lives. And part of the ceremony was my taking off my ring and giving our friends who had been our witnesses those 2 rings. And they put them in a bag that Richie's mother had made years before. And that bag hangs as the mezuzah as you enter into our living room. And we asked for blessings, 1-word blessings to go around the room. And I really felt, this home that had been our home now was my home. And while the memories of him will always be a part of it, it will unfold in ways, new friends and new experiences. And it was very powerful and really important. I actually write about this in Lilith, which is this month's Lilith. So anybody wants to check it out, you can find it.
Thank you for sharing that. That's really beautiful. And I know that you've said to me actually in our conversations about the book that, that promoting the book by yourself is not what you had in mind, and not as fun as it would have been to be doing this and, together. But for me, watching you talk about this book, as I've had the, privilege of seeing you do several times, it's very clear that Rich is very much with you and very much on every page of the book, of course, and that he is so present in this project, even though he is not able to be physically present as part of it.
Thanks.
One of the questions that came up in the chat that Leslie asked is, we've talked a lot about some of the interesting challenges of getting older and thinking about different generations and passing on legacies and traditions and all the family relations. How is this process or this time period different for people who are single and who do not have children and are not navigating those particular, generational legacy pieces within their own families?
So if I were to write the book again, I would be paying more attention to that. And again, this is also something that has emerged because of the pandemic and paying more attention in the community where I live to how different people are responding. Being alone is different from not being alone. I mean, there are challenges in both. But I have children, they live far away, but if they could, and I needed them, they would be here in a minute. What about someone who is a solo ager, someone who doesn't have immediate family? We didn't really address that in the book. And I think that that's something that we need to pay more attention to as we think about creating the kind of communities that will sustain us as we grow older. Another thing that I don't think we paid enough attention in the book is to the LGBTQ community and the particular challenges of growing older in that community. I think that is something that, again, I'm noticing much more now than I did when we were writing the book, and I would pay more attention now.
Well, as Rabbi Magal said in the comments, that's great. You already have your work cut out for you for the second edition.
Tell it to my publisher, right?
And Dina's asking about the difficulty of ritual when one is alone. How does the alone, the solo piece affect the ritual piece potentially?
So in creating ritual, one of the first questions is, who is the community, right? I am the subject of the ritual, but the first question is, who is the community? Who did I want to include? I am part of a congregation. I could have done this in front of the entire congregation. That could have been my community, but it didn't feel right. So I would ask someone who is alone to begin to think about who is the community that you want to be the witnesses for this ritual. I do think in general that ritual is something that is public in the sense that there are witnesses. It doesn't mean that there are millions of people, but it might mean that there are some people. So who are those? That discernment is really much a part of what it means to create a ritual.
Mm-hmm. So one of the things that you already mentioned briefly, but I want to dive into more deeply, is this question about how the Jewish community is responding to, or maybe not responding to, the boomer generation and the needs of the boomer generation. You actually recently wrote a great piece about this in E Jewish Philanthropy, and we'll share that link in the chat. But in that article, you describe some of the problem, especially in light of the coronavirus, and you suggest some of the ways that the Jewish community could be doing better in paying attention to the needs of younger, older people. So can you talk a little bit about how you're thinking about this?
So, what does it mean that these moments are all coming together? We can't pretend that we're not growing older. Isolation is real. Technology is a challenge. Intergenerational possibilities are important. What would it look like for the Jewish community to begin to now ask the question, after this is over, what do we want the Jewish community to look like? I really hope that after this is over, that the active older adults in all the different manifestations of the way we are, some of us with partners, some of us partnerless, some of us with children, some of us not, some of us grandparents, some of us not, some of us grandparents with wonderful relationships with our grandchildren, some of us with grandchildren with not such good relationships. I mean, the Jewish community needs to notice this cohort. We're a large cohort, a huge cohort, and we have energy and resources and talent and expertise, and we want to give back. So what would it look like for us now to begin to think about what happens then? What kind of research do we need to do to find out what our needs are? What kind of mapping ought we to be doing to see actually what's going on out there? What kind of exploration of different ways of creating community need to be explored? And so we put out a list of things that we hope we will begin to think about. And my hope is actually that we create a kind of a network of folks that are doing work that includes this age cohort, and that we begin really to talk to each other and think about how we can connect us to the Jewish community in ways that are powerfully important. The Jewish community talks about lador vador, from generation to generation. I think that it's time to start to talk about dor vador, generation with generation. It isn't just me giving to a younger generation. It's also me learning from an older generation, but it's also a younger generation being part of my life and me learning from that. So that's all part of this agenda, and we'll see, moving forward, whether we get interest about it. I mean, for example, Repair the World, a wonderful organization that links millennials with service opportunities. At this moment in time, hopefully they are beginning to imagine what it would look like to also have us be involved in that. I have the skills, I have the talents, I actually have the time. How would I find what is the best use of my skills and resources? So those are the kinds of conversations, the partnerships that we need to begin to think about that will enrich our lives and basically change the paradigm of what it means to grow older.
It is an interesting thing to see, because I think there's so many, and this is true of not only in the Jewish community, I see this also so much in the way in the feminist community as well, there's so many stereotypes about different generations and so many preconceived notions and sort of very rigid ideas. And my experience actually is that when we actually, there's a sense that the Jewish community, first of all, is mostly interested in young people and investing in young people, but there's also a kind of stereotype that young people don't want to listen to older people.
Right.
And I have the privilege of getting to work with young people. I mean, some of my staff are young people, but also we have a fellowship for Gen Z, not millennials, for Gen Z teens, and have quite our Rising Voices Fellowship. And now we have quite a large alumni group from that community who are in college and just beginning to leave college. And my experience with them has been that actually they are very much open to learning from older people. And we have them do interviews with people in their, in their lives, their parents, grandparents, parents, friends, coaches, teachers. And it's been fascinating to see that, they understand that they don't want to have to reinvent the wheel, and they don't want to, they don't believe that they have the only wisdom. They very much want to be able to engage in meaningful conversations. I think sometimes it's hard to know where to start, or it's hard to know kind of how do you engage, where do you start really, and there's, so I think you're right that there needs to be some structure to that. There needs to be some sense in the way the Jewish community faces it that this isn't about pitting generations against each other. It's very much about those intergenerational interdependencies, which I think we see, as you're saying, now more than ever in this particular moment.
And it is true that Jewish institutions are faith institutions in general, and Jewish institutions are one of the few institutions that still exist where a certain kind of intergenerational connection is possible, right? The village that is connected to my synagogue, there's an early childhood center, and there's a religious school, and there are teens, and what does it look like if we all can be connected? And I think that as we think about senior housing, we should be thinking about intergenerational housing. I mean, how wonderful would it be to be in a kind of co-housing setting where I had my own home, and next door is a family raising kids, and what would that look like? We need to start thinking about it, because we, after this epidemic, are going to want to grow older differently. Some of us will want to age in place. Some of us will want to share our homes. Some of us will want to move into who knows what. And the who knows what we need to think about and begin to create together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a very positive way to think about what we can learn from this moment and reframe to address problems that were already there, but which were a little bit, we've sharpened them in this particular moment. Tell us a little bit about what response to the book has been like. It came out in the fall, so you've been out and about talking to people. What are the kinds of stories that you're hearing?
Well, I was on a book tour, and then the book tour ended, and it was very moving as I had the opportunity to talk about the book in places, and people would come up after and want to share their stories, their challenges, and some of their successes, what they were most proud of, and what they were not, what scared them. I mean, so this is real. I mean, people really want to talk about this, and there aren't that many places where you really can talk about this, right? So the response to the book has been, this is an opportunity for us to begin to really share our experiences, and it gets back to the notion of stories.
And also another previous structure from the 60s, consciousness raising. In some ways, you need consciousness raising groups for older people to really talk about what the reality of their lives are like and notice the structural elements of it.
There's a wonderful energy in the Jewish community that was created through the book Wise Aging by Rabbi Rachel Cowan and Linda Thal. And
I think Linda Thal is actually with us tonight online.
Hi, Linda. There are many groups around the country of people doing exactly that, using that book as a starting point, talking in a very intimate way in small groups, usually in people's homes, about what all of these issues about growing older. So yes, consciousness raising, yes, an opportunity to kind of share those kinds of experience. So that was one response to the book. The book won a National Jewish Book Award finalist award, and the day after it was published, it was the #1 on the Amazon Jewish Life list, so that was good.
Nice.
I think that people are finding it helpful, as opposed to some of the other books that are about growing older. This is not a sermon. This is really a toolkit, and it does challenges assumptions about what it means to get older. If I were to say what the bottom line of the book is, I think the bottom line is that 70 is not the new 50. 70 is the new 70. We're doing this differently. And ultimately, I think this whole energy, again, maybe through the pandemic and after the pandemic, is to change the way the world views older people, to change the way the Jewish community views growing older, but mostly to change the way we think about ourselves as we grow older, and to use that, all that we bring, all the experience, all the energy, all the resources, all the curiosity, all the, whoa, you know, I'm very curious about living a long time to look back and see what changes happen. You know, there's a lot of reasons to want to stay active and engaged, and we're going to do it differently if we do it together. And I think that's what the book is about.
So how can people do it together? Olivia's asked us if, for folks who are interested in joining a group like a Wise Aging group, how do people find those? Well,
I think that you could look at the book and find some of the actual resources. There are, one of the challenges with a book that is a book and not a website is that it, some of the links are probably no longer accurate, but I have a website and we're listing resources. You could call your local synagogue or JCC and ask. Somebody in many of our communities is running these groups. You just have to find them. And it's not that hard to do. So depending, or you could just email me at rabbilaurageller.com, tell me where you live, and I'll find you who are the people in your community that are doing this. So it's actually pretty easy to do. Also, the book is a really good book, and anybody who has the skills of being a facilitator, working with the book could facilitate a group. So whoever is asking could get a hold of the book and invite friends and, you know, begin to do it yourself.
Fabulous. And folks, if you have questions, feel free to add them to the chat. Some people have been doing that. We're always happy to take more questions. I want to talk a little bit about how you thought about the tone of the book. You've talked about trying to make it practical and not like a sermon, but one of the things that I really love about it is that you've woven in humor. There are a lot of different kinds of tones. So can you talk a little bit about how you thought about what would be most useful, accessible, hearable for people?
So we organized the book around getting good at, and there are different sections. So the first one is about getting good at gaining wisdom. And we talk about different spiritual practices. We also include a wonderful article from Reb Zalman's book, From Aging to Saging, where he gives you exercises for how to be a sage in training. That's not exactly funny, but it is, you know, so different, and the book, I should say this very clearly, Richie and I wrote much of it, but there are chapters that are written by other people where we didn't have the expertise. We reached out and asked other people to write. There's different tones in different articles. So getting good at gaining wisdom was one. The next section was getting good at getting along, how relationships change. And again, different people wrote different pieces for that. Some of them are lighter, some of them are heavier. I mean, these issues are heavy issues. Rich wrote a piece about living in the land of the sick. When he began to write that piece, he was completely healthy. Well, we didn't know that he was, you know, eventually going to have a terminal illness. And then he rewrote it a little bit after he was already diagnosed. One of the real gifts of the book is that because we were writing this book, we had to do research on everything, including planning a funeral and do you have, and different choices, and we're not making judgments. So we talk about cremation, we talk about burial, pros and cons and whatever. There's nothing that we hadn't talked about because we were writing this book together, how to have a conversation with your kids about end of life issues. We actually took our kids to on a vacation, and it's a blended family, so that's complicated. And we basically said to them, we'll take you to Mexico and we'll have a wonderful vacation. But the cost of the vacation is we're going to have the talk, the conversation. And we write about that. And it's heavy, but it's also funny about what it means to get those millennial children, particularly raised in different homes, to think about these kinds of issues. So we, and then there's an article that I find very beautiful by Nessa Rappaport, where she, different from the other articles, it's not there are not tools in it, but it's essentially a poem piece about, it's called Regarding My Body. And she talks about what it feels like to be embodied in a body that is growing older, and how or just what it feels like to kind of acknowledge the changes. Many of us have had the experience of walking in a room and looking in the mirror and suddenly saying, what's my mother doing here? How did she get here? I mean, so those kinds of, both funny and also poignant and serious.
So I'm 46 years old, which isn't that old, but is older than I think of myself as being. And I'm also currently trapped at home with 2 13-year-olds. So I feel like I'm aging about 10 years every day, to be honest.
Right.
How early can people start practicing at getting good at getting older? I mean, getting good at getting older, we're all getting older all the time.
Absolutely right.
So how did you think about that as you were writing? Sort of how I mean, obviously you were writing it for a particular demographic, right, but do you feel like there are pieces that speak to the process of aging at any age?
Sure, a lot of them do. Certainly the spiritual practices, getting good at getting, with the same,
right. I'd like to be a sage in training right now. I'm going to start that. And
maybe you have a practice of meditation now that didn't wait until you were 70 to start it. And then journaling, and Tiffany Schlein has a piece about Tech Shabbat. Not connected to age. I mean, these are spiritual practices. They're particularly relevant maybe for somebody in my age cohort, but not necessarily. But I mean, what we did find is in this age cohort, and we're talking not about chronological age, but functional age, right? But in this life stage, people have more time than they did to ask certain kinds of questions. When you're very busy, home with 2 kids, trying to be, you don't necessarily have the time or the spaciousness to ask questions like, what am I doing? And is this what I want to be doing? And I think there's something powerful that happens when you realize that there's less time ahead than there was behind. Mm-hmm. So I am very aware of that. You are probably less aware of that. And my millennial children are even less aware of that. But it's true that, and maybe the virus reminds us of this, life is very fragile, and at any moment, who knows, so that these issues are relevant. The chapter about end of life directives, which was written by Rabbi Elliot Dorff, a wonderful teacher, and he, that doesn't say it in the book, but when we were speaking about the book, as he's encouraging people to write these end of life directives, he actually suggested that synagogues should require or encourage whatever confirmation kids as they are about to get their licenses to write an end of life directive. Ooh. Why? Because you have to, when you get a license, decide whether you're going to be an organ donor or not. And how powerful would it be if this was part of preparation for driving, that a young person needed to focus on the truth that, driving is a really significant responsibility, and we ought to be thinking it would really change the conversation. I must admit that when Elliot first mentioned this to me, I raised it with some of the leaders at Temple Emmanuel years ago, and they said, "What, are you crazy? I wouldn't want to do that."
Right.
But you know, it's important. These end of life discussions are important. When we took our kids away and we began to talk about what we wanted, they each asked for a copy of 5 wishes, and that they would begin to think about it for themselves as well. And now, because of the coronavirus, we all know that, whoa, we ought to be having these conversations, all of us.
Mm-hmm. One of the questions that we have here from Anne, which I think also is relevant in this moment, is the issue of being a caregiver and how that affects aging. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So I can't really talk about it except to be incredibly grateful to the wonderful caregivers for my 98-year-old mother, who's living in a Jewish wonderful continuing care facility outside of Boston. Again, there's a whole lot of other issues that one could have put in this book. It's also important to know that, like, a lot of people are writing about this. There is a website called nextavenue.org, which is a curated website connected to NPR that deals with issues of people over 50. And they have wonderful articles about caregiving and about, everything that we're talking about. So you can access it, not in a Jewish way, but you can access it. AARP is doing wonderful work around this as well. So there are resources out there. It's interesting that when Richie and I first imagined the book, and we found a wonderful agent, and we had this agent look for publishers, a lot of publishers said, "Oh, this is a great book, but it's too Jewish. You need to write a boomer catalog, not a Jewish boomer catalog." Well, we couldn't do that. We don't, we know Jewish, but we didn't know. But there's no whole earth catalog for boomers, although there are many websites. So we're in a different universe, and maybe websites take the place of or curated conversations like this.
So there's some questions, some more sort of personal questions about your process, and both as a writer and as an ager, that have come up. Louisa's asking what the most difficult part of the book, writing the book, was for you personally, and where you grew the most in this process.
I think the most difficult part for me was finishing it after Richie died. He had a perfect death, if you can call a death that's 20 years too early perfect. But it was perfect, again, because we had talked about everything. So the book was essentially, written, but there was still a lot of stuff that needed to be done, including new pieces that needed to be written because he had died. We didn't think about mourning. There are a lot of good books about mourning. We didn't think about mourning from the perspective of somebody like me. And so there were new articles that needed to be written. So I think maybe that was the most difficult. But Louisa is my cousin, I think. Hi, Louisa. And I do want to say that one of the things that I wanted to say about the technology piece is, and about stories, sharing stories. So I'm part of a group of cousins who all turned 50 the same year, 20 years ago. And since then, we've been meeting once a year as on a retreat. And because of the pandemic, we now have a WhatsApp group. And among the things that we're sharing on this WhatsApp group is, how are you doing, and all this kind of stuff, but also, pictures of our grandparents and recipes. And, who would know that I would ever need that, but I do. So the use of technology to keep people connected, to reach to people who used to be part of my life but aren't anymore, to find new people and find ways of cultivating relationships through this new technology. All of this is hugely important. It relates to Story Aperture. And I guess not exactly as an answer to your question, but one of the power of stories, and also this cousins chat, is the resilience of our ancestors. and Jewish women in particular. You know, we've been through bad stuff before, and look, here we still are. And to be able to share those stories and know those stories is really comforting at this time. And that's why the work that the Jewish Women's Archive does is so very important.
Thank you. Yes, we certainly feel like there's an urgency to our work. We think that all the time, but we can see people resonating with it in different ways right now. And we have a question about what's giving you the most joy as you grow older. Question from Ellen, which I think is a nice question to bring us close to the end.
Well, I have 2 grandchildren, 5-year-old and a 3-year-old, and they bring me a lot of joy right now through FaceTime or Zoom, but I look forward to when they live in Portland and I live in Los Angeles. At least we're in the same time zone. I think that also what brings me joy is, recognizing that this growing older stuff, complicated as it is, if it isn't also accompanied by joy, we're in trouble. So what are the things that give me pleasure? So a bunch of people in this virtual village of ours do line dancing, and they just have a lot of fun with it, so what are the things that are fun? So for me, it's certain kinds of reading, walks that I'm taking with friends, learning to cook with my stepdaughter, recognizing the possibility that I have opportunities now that I didn't have before. I have more time, and just the joy is important. Nachman of Bratslav says it's not incidental, it is in fact essential to the spiritual task. So how do we find things that give each of us joy? It's different for each of us, but it's really important to pay attention and to want to find ways to access it.
Absolutely. And as you said, though the book is heavy in some ways, there is joy in every, piece of it, including the little cute drawings, which I really love. I'd love to end with the poem that is the epilogue,
Okay.
which is really about how we're always teaching and learning, which is so key to the work that we do at JWA and to this question of legacy.
This is a poem by Hannah Block, wonderful poet. May her memory be a blessing. I used to study the bigger kids. They'd show and tell me how to wiggle my hips, how to razz the boys. Now I'm watching my cohort master the skills at each grade of incapacity and get promoted to the next. To the oldest, I'm a novice. These 75-year-olds, they think they know everything, says cousin Leo. He's 90. Who thinks, Leo? Who knows? We're too busy reading Gratitude and Being Mortal, passing around the revised edition of Dying for Dummies, still trying to get it right. And the young study us.
Thank you.
Thank you for this opportunity. And again, my website, RabbiLauraGeller.com. I'd love to hear from people, and we'll be delighted to be in correspondence with any of you.
And I want to thank you for this book, because I am, my generation is looking to yours to forge this path, as you have forged many paths before, and reinvent this new life stage so that we have a sense of how to do it even better when we get there. So thank you for doing that and for making that possible and for sharing your wisdom and your life experience with us tonight and through the book. And I feel so lucky that I get to learn from you regularly. So thank you.
Thank you. I feel the same way about you. Thank you.
Thank you. Intergenerational connections right here.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Thank you all of us thanks to all of you for joining us. We've had about 400 people online with us tonight, which is fabulous. I hope that you will all come back next week, same time, same place, for our conversation with Anna Solomon on her new novel, The Book of V, which is loosely based around the story of the Book of Esther, which is very cool. So check that out. And then the following week with the poet Rachel Zucker, who's one of my personal heroes. If you're looking for more conversations like these, check out our podcast, Can We Talk? which you can find wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on our site. We just released a new episode, which is great for book lovers. It is an intergenerational reflection on Judy Blume's classic, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, which is celebrating its 50th anniversary this year. And the podcast is a conversation of me and Nahani Rouse, our podcast producer and host, with our 2 teenage daughters. So if you like intergenerational conversation and you like books, that is a great episode for you. And I'm also happy to share, as I think I mentioned last week, that in June, we're going to be piloting a new series on Jewish women in history. At this time, we're going to be interspersing it with the Quarantine Book Club as we go forward. So stay tuned for more information about that. And wishing everybody a good night. Stay safe, stay healthy. We look forward to seeing you again very soon. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks, Laura. This was fabulous.